Yeah.
What can I, oh, you got it.
You are live.
Okay.
Oh,
Good morning. That screen. Good morning. Today is Wednesday, April 5th. This is a morning session of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're resuming our work on a pair of related, a bill and a rule related to anti-degradation. And we had a great first meeting, mostly focused on the statutory portion of the whole issue. And we asked you to come back. Thanks so much for doing so, to help us understand the rule that it's related to. And so if you could give the committee and folks watching a walkthrough on the rule, that would be very helpful. So
happy to do that, Chair Bray, and thank you for having us back. For the record, my name is Pete LaFlamme. I'm the Director of the Watershed Management Division at Vermont DEC, and I'm joined today.
My name is Bethany Sargent, and I'm the Program Manager for the Monitoring Assessment Program in Vermont DEC.
And as I mentioned, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and be able to brief the committee on our anti-degradation rule. I will say, as we mentioned when we were here last week, that we met with a group of stakeholders representing all sides of this issue, different perspectives were brought to the table, and we met with them in a series of, well, now I've lost count, but during the formal stakeholder meeting, we had at least 8 meetings, each of which were several hours long over the course of 13 months. And the folks at the table were all practitioners in one way or another of anti-deg. The reason I'm saying all of this is it's a deep topic. We have a limited PowerPoint presentation this morning to hit the high points of this topic, and we're certainly happy to chat with you and answer your questions. But this does not dive deep into the elements of the rule, but instead it's intended to provide a good overview of the process and the rule that we now have prepping for LPAR.
great. And for people who are wondering, do you have a rough timeline for when that will, go to Secretary of State and then off to LPAR and all this?
We're looking probably at another month or two in
Okay.
that process.
So before we get into more of the details of anti-deg, just a quick refresher about some of what we talked about last week, because the basis for the anti-degradation rule is in the Vermont Water Quality Standards. So I want to just walk through a few of the key components that explain sort of the fundamentals that will be applied in the anti-degradation implementation rule. So the Vermont Water Quality Standards have 3 primary components, and I'll talk a little bit about each one of these, but those are the designated uses, the management objectives, and the minimum water quality criteria, and then finally the anti-degradation policy. So the designated uses, of which there are 8 and they're listed here, you can think of as the values that all of our surface waters need to support. All of these things need to be protected and maintained within that surface water. So things like aquatic biota, boating and swimming, and other forms of contact or non-contact recreation, things like aesthetics, use as a public water source. So those are all examples of our designated uses.
And are those applied to every body of water?
So for the most part, the public water source is one that's unique, and that's our A2 classification, but every surface water must be able to support being used as a drinking water with filtration. So this is where we get into the classes of those designated uses. And so we talked some about that last week. But for A1 and B1, those are what we term our very high quality waters. Those can be used for things, the designated uses like aquatic biota, like aesthetics. Those are the classes that can be applied. A2, as I mentioned, is our public water source. And so the classes of those waters set the minimum water quality criteria. So you can see the graph that's on the right, and you can think of that horizontal dotted line as the minimum water quality for that class. So we can never go below that minimum water quality criteria. If we do that, water is considered impaired and not meeting its designated use for that class. So the arrows indicate what is termed assimilative capacity. It is the amount, it is the water quality above that minimum criteria. So when we're evaluating a proposed activity, we're looking at permitting a limited amount of degradation above that minimum criteria, but we can never permit below it. So as we mentioned, B2 is considered sort of the default class of Vermont waters. That's good water quality. Every surface water in the state has a class. The default class by statute is B2, except for all waters above 2,500 feet are Class A, unless they're explicitly designated as a public water source, which is A2. All waters below 2,500 feet are B2 unless they are reclassified, which is really our objective in terms of classifying according to the water quality.
Can you remind us how many waters fall into those classes?
For the most part, so I can give you the total number of surface waters. So we have roughly 800 lakes and ponds, roughly 23,000 miles of rivers and streams. I don't have in terms of how many of those waters, mileage, I could get that, are above 2,500 feet, but I can expressly say that the only waters beyond those that are above 2,500 feet that we reclassify, there are waters within some of the wilderness areas of Green Mountain National Forest, for example, like the Breadloaf Wilderness area that have been reclassified. And then we reclassified in our last water quality standards 3 streams in and around Ripton, Vermont.
One, in terms of class now, we mentioned the wilderness areas.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking for an absence of human-produced contamination or any contamination? Some natural waters are pretty funky. I guess that's what I'm getting at here.
So the water quality standards have a section in them that is termed natural influences. So something like a beaver dam could impact what that stream looks like.
Yeah.
That's a great example to think about. But when we're considering what the impact on a potential stream is, we're looking at how human activity is, potentially degrading that stream. We have A1 waters that have activities going on in the watershed, whether it's, areas that are used for, for houses, if it's logging. We have B1 waters or candidate B1. We don't have any B1s at this point, but candidate B1 where there is agriculture going on in the watershed. So there are, you can use land responsibly and still maintain this very high quality water.
So are there A1 waters that you would not want to drink?
I would recommend, and this is where beavers come into play again, that you
Yeah.
always filter and treat your water before drinking it.
Bring a little infrared light.
Or, yeah. It's a good question.
Fever.
Yeah.
Which I experienced once, and I wouldn't recommend it.
Funny, in a completely different context, the chair and I were discussing getting dehydrated out in the woods.
Right,
That's what I like.
Yeah. So in terms of the anti-degradation, just wanted to describe what it is overall. So anti-degradation is mandated by the Federal Clean Water Act and also Vermont state statute. And what it does is it limits how much water quality degradation can occur above, again, always above that minimum criteria, unless it is necessary. So it has to be in some ways justified to avoid important, substantial socioeconomic impacts to people of the state. And we'll get back to that language in a little bit. But it, you know, as I mentioned, it requires the maintenance and protection of water quality to support uses, to support those designated uses. And we implement it through permits for new or increased discharges when we're evaluating a proposed activity's compliance with the water quality standards. So that is what anti-degradation does. And again, it limits that incremental water quality degradation. We can still, you know, it can still permit some degradation, but always above that minimum criteria and always in a limited way.
Unless it is necessary to avoid substantial socioeconomic impacts,
To
that's
keep-
still within, you need to stay in the same range.
Correct,
Okay.
correct. So our anti-degradation policy is within the Vermont Water Quality Standards, as I mentioned. And there are 3 tiers of protection or 3 tiers of analysis in terms of how we're considering any proposed activity. And we'll walk through what those tiers are. Pete's gonna walk through it in a minute. But the first tier is tier 3, and that is how we protect and maintain the water quality of our outstanding resource waters. So that comes to us from 10 VSA 1424A, a series of values for which a surface water may be designated as an outstanding resource water, and that too happens through the water quality standards. Tier 2 is really the heart of anti-deg, and that is applied to high quality waters. And again, as I mentioned, it limits that incremental degradation that can occur above that minimum criteria in order to avoid those substantial adverse socioeconomic impacts. And you'll see this language again in terms of the implementation role. And then finally, tier 1 is to ensure that existing uses are protected and maintained. So you can think of that as that floor of water quality. So if it's a B2, you can never go below that B2 criteria. Or if it's a B1, below the B1 minimum criteria, or for A1, below that A1.
Thank you. What is an outstanding resource water?
So that's a water. So 10 VSA 1424 allows the designation of a surface water for its exceptional scenic, recreational, natural, or cultural values. It's the basis of it is from the Federal Clean Water Act as an outstanding national resource water is the way that it's termed in the Clean Water Act. Vermont has 4 that have been designated, and I believe it was 1991 and 1995 as outstanding resource waters. And again, that's part of the water quality standards. So those are meant to be, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we protect them through anti-deg, but that is more considered an absolute protection in terms of the water quality necessary to support the maintenance of those values for which it was designated.
There are not that many outstanding.
There are not that many.
Can you name
Can I name them? One of them is the Pulteney. And I believe, do you remember the?
No, I don't. We
The
have.
Bat- Yeah, they're in the standards.
There's a section of the bat tail.
The bat and tail, yes, thank you.
Ice falls and strut. Next,
To the roof effort to name them.
Yeah.
we do this Hanukkah every year. Game all the
Right.
Yeah. Pompanusa.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. For me, I know it would take the role.
The other is an outstanding.
There might be a segment of it, but it's.
Right.
They're all
It's a
segments.
limited-
Oh,
They're all limited
This is a
pitches.
lovely little river, but it's kind of slow moving. I
Mhm.
wouldn't think it was particularly good water compared to other rivers.
And it is outstanding. It's a very broad range of values. So it doesn't necessarily have to be explicitly water quality. It could be scenic,
values.
or it could be cultural,
The aesthetic
or,
Ex-
yes,
Exactly.
is what you would have
Right.
scenic under, or.
Exactly, more the aesthetic of the place, so like a beautiful waterfall, as opposed to necessarily the aesthetic of the water column itself, which is the aesthetic value that's in the water quality standards. So it's different, it's more a sense of place, it's more a sense of importance on a statewide level based upon the criteria that Bethany mentioned. It could be, outstanding cultural resource.
and as the Clean Water Act envisioned, the outstanding national resource waters, like the examples it gave were like waters, surface waters in national parks and other public
Right.
lands.
I think the White River and its water falls.
Yes,
So Bristol Falls.
I
is
say yes.
Where I live. is,
Yeah,
big part of summertime culture. So is that sort of spot considered for elevation to an outstanding resource water because of how much a part, how big a role it plays in summertime water culture over that way?
it could be.
It's a
Yeah.
petition-driven process, so we would entertain petitions from, interested groups to nominate. The criteria for elevating it to that status are difficult. And then you'll see that protection is pretty much absolute. Prohibition against pretty much any activity. We'll get into that in just a second.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe my neighbors will be unhappy coming out standing resource water, you won't be able to park there. Right. Okay. Be careful what you wish for, I think. Maybe one.
Yeah,
So Bethany covered the three tiers that are in the policy in the water quality standards. So there are two parts of anti-degradation. There's the anti-deg policy and standards that comes to us from the Federal Clean Water Act and has been a part of our standards since the beginning. And then there is the actual implementation. So how do you implement this policy? And anti-degradation implementation is the subject of the rule that we're here to brief you on today. So the prefacing that we just did is to sort of orient you as to what the anti-deg implementation rule does. And just as a quick review, as Bethany mentioned, it only applies to high quality waters. And this term gets confused with the term, the casual term we use. High quality waters is more or less a trademarked term in water law. And a high quality water is any water that's above the minimum. So you remember the graph that Bethany showed a few moments ago, where there was a range and there was a double-ended arrow that showed a similar capacity. So any water that's above that minimum floor is a high-quality water, and it's on a parameter-by-parameter basis. So all waters in the state of Vermont are high quality for one parameter or another. There are certain waters where we're below that threshold, where we're below the minimum, and those waters are referred to as impaired. At the upper range of high quality waters, when we talk about A1 and B1 watersheds, we modify that a bit and call them casually higher quality waters. So high quality waters has a meaning for anti-deg. Higher quality waters is a term that we use to refer to the very, very best waters.
Mr. Chair.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Bray. So going back to that chart, I'm now confused.
Okay.
So what is the higher quality water? It's all of A1 and B1
It's a casual term. It doesn't necessarily have.
within each of those
Right,
categories?
exactly. You could say within each of those categories, the upper end of the range of high quality would be a higher.
But it
quality
doesn't
water.
mean anything
Doesn't, it's
real.
waters that would be good candidates for.
Moving
reclassification.
up the,
Exactly, that's exactly right.
okay.
So with that whole chart,
Put it
were
together.
B2, and there were not B1 or A1 waters, which is pretty much the reality as we've described.
Yeah.
Those waters at the very upper end of the range would be referred to as higher quality waters. Those waters, we could permit gradually, slowly, lowering down to the threshold, to the floor of B2, unless we reset those classifications and establish new floors higher up on that y-axis of quality
Yeah,
to limit the ultimate lowering of those waters.
okay, I see what you're saying, because it's within that. Okay, is there a Is there a metric that you use for that?
No,
There's it is
it's
more,
the waters that we
it's
know
free flowing.
is, thank you. It's the waters that are at the upper end of that range that we want to imbue with additional protection through reclassification to a higher class.
And do you have a list of those?
We do.
Okay, cool. And will we get to see that list?
We've provided it.
You did, okay. Is that in that's in our handouts?
I sent it last week.
Okay, I'll take a look. Would it be
We're
under
happy to
you?
resend
Okay, I'll take a look under the bill.
Yeah, and you
'Cause
can
I didn't
check with
see it.
Jude, I think most things that come to the committee, she just automatically puts into our
Yeah.
our website.
So it would be
I
under the
didn't
bill.
go chase that down to see if it actually got put up.
So again, anti-degradation implementation applies to high quality waters, those that either exceed the minimum criteria for their particular class. It's only applicable in permitting decisions. So we use anti-deg as a tool in making our permitting decisions for new or increased discharges when proposed activity indexes to compliance with the water quality standards. And most of the permitting programs in Chapter 47 do index with the necessity of meeting the water quality standards. That link to you must meet the water quality standards ties into the policy, and from the policy it flows to anti-deg implementation. And
Sorry, quick question. So you mentioned if one or more parameters slips below the floor
yeah,
and sufficiently impaired, and I can't remember the number, is there like a 501 list or?
303D. Yeah,
303D?
different number, but yes,
yes,
yeah,
we
that's the,
produce that every 2 years. Sorry.
that's okay.
We produce that every 2 years as a requirement for our delegation with EPA. So we list waters, but we list them on a parameter by parameter basis. So if a water were impaired, say for phosphorus, it would still potentially be high quality for other parameters and for other uses. And then in most cases, except for the outstanding resource waters that we spoke of in a minute, and I'll get into more detail on the next slide, but in most cases, implementation of anti-degradation allows degradation, but the degradation must be limited. It never can go below the minimum criteria and may only occur to avoid substantial adverse socioeconomic losses. So one casual interpretation of anti-deg is that you can never allow degradation. Anti-degradation is a means within our permitting processes for evaluating whether a limited lower, again, limited within that range of a similar capacity, is justified. Are there alternatives? And if to say no would result in substantial adverse socioeconomic loss. So anti-degradation in a nutshell is covered there in that third bullet. That's the concept of anti-degradation. A lot of folks come to it and look at the word and think that's no degradation. That would be a non-degradation policy. Anti-degradation allows for limited lowering. Again, it's provided for in the Act, and all states adopt policies and procedures that do allow for that tier 2 lowering. I'll talk more in a moment about that, but it's an important concept. So here's tier 3. So I'm just going to walk through with a bit more information about each of the 3 tiers. So you remember Bethany described tier 3, tier 2, and tier 1. So I'm going to walk through those 3 tiers. So tier 3 again was protection of outstanding resource waters. And so existing water quality associated with their exceptional natural, recreational, cultural, or scenic values, those are the criteria for nominating a water to be an ORW, shall be maintained and protected. So this is the closest anti-degradation comes to a true non-degradation policy in these ORWs. And discharges to these waters may only be permitted if necessary to maintain current environmental conditions or to improve water quality, or if the discharge is temporary and receiving water quality is expected to be maintained or improved relative to that which existed before the discharge. So those are the only 2 instances where we can permit a discharge to an ORW. So these are more or less absolute protection.
What would be an example, please, of a discharge to maintain current environmental conditions?
To maintain or improve current environmental conditions, the best example I can think of right now is, for example, our 3-acre stormwater permit, our 3-acre retrofit permits, where there's an existing impervious surface that doesn't have a permit, and we're requiring an upgrade and retrofit of that surface to reduce the runoff. to treat and control and then issue a permit for it. So we would be able to issue such a permit that improves or maintains water quality in an RWA.
Okay, so there would still be a discharge, but you're improving the quality of that.
Exactly.
discharge.
Exactly. It's a currently unpermitted situation. In order to be able to actually move forward and issue a legal discharge permit, we would need that improvement to fit in under an RWA.
Turn it down.
So when you have a tile drain, which is by statute not a discharge, how do you limit the non-discharge discharges?
It's a great question. If you wait for another couple of slides, I'm going to talk about non-point sources, which is how we consider tile drainage. Thank you. So now that was tier 3. Now we're moving down in the tiers. And as Bethany said, tier 2 is really where most of the work of anti-degradation actually occurs because we have so few ORWs and because that protection is absolute. So tier 2 is the protection of high quality waters. And again, those waters that meet or are above the minimum criteria. And we only allow a limited reduction in the existing quality of those high quality waters when we show through the applicable permitting or approval process that the secretary provides public notice of the decision, opportunity for public comment on the decision. And we do that after an analysis of alternatives. Allowing that lower water quality is necessary to prevent substantial adverse economic or social impacts to the people of the state. And then here's the answer to your question, Senator McDonald. In order to do that, we have to make the determination that shall we achieve the highest statutory and regulatory requirements for all new or existing point sources and all cost-effective and reasonable best management practices for non-point source control consistent with state law. So currently, the RAPs for agriculture and the AMPs for logging operations are the two major best management practices that exist for non-point source control consistent with state law. As you know, there has been a recommendation from the environmental groups to dive into that topic further, to have a study committee to take a look at that as part of this overall effort. But as we sit here today, it's the RAPs and the AMPs.
Senator Watson and Senator White.
Okay, I'm familiar with RAPs, but AMPs?
The accepted management practices, those are sort of the equivalent, if you will, a rough equivalent, if you will, for logging operations.
Oh, okay, great,
So there's a series of DMPs necessary for logging jobs.
great, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Bray. I appreciate you bringing up the suggestion to have the stakeholder meeting. I'm very supportive of exploring that in this bill. I think it's an important conversation and to get everyone in the room to discuss how it impacts both farms, having ANR, having ag all together. That would be a helpful step forward. So I would certainly love to see that suggestion being taken up in the bill. And I've heard that you noted that it's coming up, but how do you have a position on it if it were to be added to the bill?
Well, we're gonna go into the bill. Sorry.
Okay, so wait on that.
First, we're really trying to get the rule walk through,
Sure.
and then we're gonna come back to the back and forth that's been going on the rule.
Okay, I'll wait, no rush.
Thank you, sir. You wait. Going on in tier 2, this is the second of 2 slides on tier 2. So these are the considerations that we look at when we're evaluating a particular discharge to a high quality water, which again is the common situation. So when you think it through, does the receiving water meet or exceed the minimum water quality criteria? In other words, that first bullet it's a confirmation that this is in fact a high quality water for the parameter under consideration. How far above the minimum water quality criteria is that receiving water? In other words, you could look at that as how much a similar capacity or the degree of high quality of this particular receiving water. What would be the effect of the proposed activity on that receiving water quality? How much would this individual permit actually affect, this individual permitting decision actually affect the receiving water quality? And then finally, is that amount of lowering justified by avoidance of substantial socioeconomic impact to the people of the state? That's the test that we have to prove as a result of the existing anti-dig policy.
Sure. So I don't know if you're gonna go into it in a subsequent slide, but I would love to better understand avoiding substantial socioeconomic impacts to the people of the state.
It was a rich topic of discussion during our stakeholder group, as you can imagine, and it's really, we're evaluating a limited lowering. When you look at a metric of water quality, a part per million and a unit per liter of limited lowering, and you're trying to juxtapose that with costs essentially, or other sociological impacts to the people of the state, excuse me. It's a tough balance. It's, a lot of individual permits, and it's a balancing. So again, how much reduction from a particular project results gets to the degree of analysis around the socioeconomic factors. So if it's like a major new wastewater discharge that would have a moderate impact, I'll say, on downstream waters, the socioeconomic analysis there would be a lot more involved than a socioeconomic analysis, say, for a 3-acre impervious surface that would not really have a measurable impact on the receiving water.
I think what I'm getting a little fuzzy when I'm trying to think my way through it is avoidance of a substantial socioeconomic impact. So I can imagine that doing a project, are we saying there's a socioeconomic benefit that could be gained, but it's going to come at some environmental cost? And so we're measuring a gain against a cost? What's
that is one potential, and the other potential is looking at alternatives to the particular discharge. So could we do more? Are there alternatives to this particular discharge and that limited lowering that would occur? And would requiring those alternatives trigger that adverse socioeconomic impact? In other words, it's going to cost more and more and more to provide treatment. And those costs increase along a curve, if you will, an exponential curve of increasing costs with increasing water quality benefit through reduction of impact. And you get to a point where those costs take off and your costs accelerate rapidly for marginal increased water quality benefit, the so-called knee of the curve. And that's where this analysis usually ends up.
Okay, and that phrase to the people of the state. So is that it sounds very general, and is that because waters of the state are held in common, and so we're looking at that level?
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
It's a tough analysis, balancing those two factors, as you can imagine, and we vet it through the public process. We put the anti-dig finding out as a final decision on the permit, or a draft decision on the permit. We put it out for comment, and then if necessary, people truly disagree with it after that. There's the appeal process.
And before going to center it down, can you just walk us through a more concrete example of it? I'm imagining something like, I've always thought this was a test about the value of development versus the value of treatment, or addressing, And is that what's going into the scales here?
That's exactly
Denying development that has a socioeconomic benefit versus, and that's weighed against. One seems like it's monetary, and the other seems like it's water quality, and I'm not sure how to do that math.
It's impossible math. If you have those two non-sequiturs on either side of the equal sign. So it's a good example would be our stormwater management manual. So our stormwater management manual, we update it every 5 years to take into account new practices, new technologies, new opportunities for treatment. In stormwater treatment and control, you can hold the water longer, you can put more of it into the ground, you can provide different ways of providing water quality treatment, and then also hydrologic control of that water at ever increasing costs. The longer you hold it, the more exotically you treat it, the more pollutant you remove,
Yeah.
the lesser impact on the stream, but those all come with increasing costs, and there's a break point there. And so we bring together a broad stakeholder group, and we look at new practices, we look at design criteria, and make that decision again. And it's not a decision to the third decimal place, as you can imagine.
Senator McDonald, thanks for your patience.
Well, the witnesses say determining whether or not some anti-degradation has taken place, and we are absolutely opposed to degradation, that it's a tough analysis. So who's the arbiter of the scientific analysis? And who are the arbiters of the socioeconomic analysis? And when those two groups get in a room, who comes out of the room with the answer?
Certainly an iterative process, and again, it's applied, the tier 2 SEJ, socioeconomic justification analysis, is typically applied on larger, more impactful projects. On smaller projects, runoff from parking lots, as I was just explaining, we have our stormwater management manual where every 5 years we reevaluate, we come up with a set of practices that are approved in that manual, and if you meet those practices, you're deemed to have met that socioeconomic test. So you do it once, because looking at any individual, we issue permits for impervious surfaces greater than a half an acre. And you can imagine if a new half-acre development were to occur in Montpelier and the runoff is going to make its way to the Winooski River here, it's impossible to pick up the impact of that one particular project, particularly under runoff producing conditions, which is when the discharge would occur when the river is swollen through runoff occurring throughout the watershed. Picking that individual impact from that project up is impossible. So you have to do that sort of universal evaluation of treatment and control practices and their efficacy versus their cost in the composition of the manual. And you approve the manual, that manual is then available for use. And if you meet the manual, you then meet those practices. That's different than if it were a new large point source discharge or a new large high elevation development, where then it's more of a iterative process, looking at different alternatives to the project and requiring more and more and more, seeking to minimize the impact coming from that discharge relative to the benefit that that large project might provide to the state. And the information necessary to do those analyses, a section of the anti-degradation implementation rule, if you look at it, there is a fairly exhaustive list of information required from an applicant to provide to the agency to enable us to be able to make that evaluation. But it is iterative, and it looks at alternatives. It looks at, can you do more to reduce this discharge? And if so, would requiring that then trigger this adverse socioeconomic benefit?
Mr. Chair, the witness has given an excellent example of things that could go wrong and degrade. One being impervious surfaces. And everyone will no doubt recall when some of the big parking lots next to shopping areas were constructed. The policy was that there would be silt pools where runoff would go in and the polluted matter would go into those pools.
Correct.
And water would seep into the ground and be purified, and it would evaporate.
Correct.
And then after about 20 years, you couldn't see one of those pools because they were full. And the next step was to go in and clean out all the stuff that was in there. And lo and behold, along came, I guess what you would call a socioeconomic analysis. It was too damn expensive to have these people, after 20 years who owned the impervious surface, go in and clean out the stuff so that it didn't run into the river. We have an absolute anti-degradation policy, but it doesn't, there appears to be some quasi-judicial group who has the power to say, but that's okay. what's happening is okay, and we're not going to tackle it because it's too expensive. That's what it appears that we're hearing here today.
I disagree, Senator McDonald. Our stormwater practices have evolved over time as the science has evolved nationally. Vermont has a set of stormwater treatment control practices that are nationally leading. We revamped our program in 2001. Since then, have evolved our practices twice since then. You're exactly right in that maintenance of these systems is key. They're doing what they're supposed to do, just as you described accurately. They're removing sediments from the land surface. They're encouraging groundwater recharge, which is important to maintain base flows. They're providing water quality treatment for the stream. But over time, you need to maintain those practices. And we have a very aggressive program now where we have a 5-year recertification of those practices. We have inspections, and we require, as part of our re-permitting process for those permits, people to go out and continuously maintain, depending on the nature of the practice. Some practices require more frequent maintenance than others, but we require owner certification annually, and then we require designer or professional engineer certification on a 5-year cycle to re-permit those, to do the exact same thing you're describing. Many of our older surfaces in the state, some of the older shopping centers in this area were permitted under very rudimentary sets of practices, or they may have, Vermont started really issuing stormwater permits in the late 70s, early 80s, but those were very, very rudimentary permits. Now our 3-acre retrofit permit that I was referring to Chair Bray a moment ago, that 3-acre retrofit permit requires bringing those surfaces up to modern standards. So we're going back and we're retrofitting those older surfaces to provide more significant treatment and control. And with those retrofits will come the requirement to maintain those systems.
Would it be possible to see, I don't know if proprietary information is in them, to just see a permit so that we could sort of see the back and forth between these different moving parts, like the socioeconomic impact element and the water quality discussion. I don't know if that's a helpful thing to look at. I'm just imagining, I understand all the words we're saying, and I'm also feeling like if I read a permit through or a permit application, a permit file, I don't know, and saw this sort of back and forth between factors, it might be helpful to kind of flesh it out.
Again, most of the permits that we issue are smaller permits that don't trigger that socioeconomic justification debate. They hew to requirements in our standard, like, for example, the best example is the stormwater manual. We do the anti-deg analysis when we adopt the stormwater manual by pushing the envelope to that knee of the cost curve, as it were. And then once those practices are approved, if you meet the manual, you meet anti-deg, because looking at the effect of any individual permit, it's any single individual permit, really, it's impossible to pick up the impact on the receiving water unless it's a very, very large project, which are relatively unusual because, again, these requirements are applied to or increase discharges. So,
so I'll follow with you offline.
Yeah.
Maybe sort of a bigger, wonkier thing than I'm talking about than dragging the committee all the way to it. So, Senator McCormick.
Is there any scale how much added wealth justifies how much degradation? Or is each case sort of case specific, subject to persuasion?
the cases are, most cases, as I was saying to Chair Bray a moment ago, most cases meet pre-standing requirements. And if you meet the requirements, the treatment and control practices, the extent of stormwater practices, are set forth ahead of time. You need to detain this much water for this long. You need to recharge this much water into the ground. You need to hold back these particular flooding events.
Those are
All of
in
those are-
existing permits?
Those are in our manual, and the existing permits index with the manual. So if you meet the manual, you satisfy these requirements, because again, looking at every dollar store parking lot, every, road extension into a private development, each of those things, it's impossible to evaluate the limited lowering versus the socioeconomic balance. But the concept is that if there's a greater impact, there needs to be a greater benefit. It's not indexed quantitatively. Because you're comparing dollars to milligrams.
Trying to think of like a 19th century woolen mill. You knew what color they were dyeing the wool by what color the river was.
Right.
It was all sorts of, it was a mess,
Bradford.
but that was justified that the economy of the area depended on it. So, I guess the thing is,
If that were to
It's
come in
true.
for a permit today, it would be a tough uphill battle to allow that degradation. It would violate minimum criteria for aesthetics. And it wouldn't be approved. So again, we're talking about small incremental downward movement within the range of a similar capacity, never, and I'm gonna talk about tier 1 in a second, never going below that minimum criteria for the protection of those existing uses in that class.
so there are limits even with that
Oh,
proviso.
absolutely, yes, the floor.
Okay, I guess that's what I was getting at, that just the way that last line there is worded.
We should put limited lowering. Limited should be in there before lower.
Okay.
Can I make a point, just because I think something's being really missed here, that this could help the committee, if it would be okay?
Sure, we're.
So I just wonder, I don't think the committee understands that the A&R, the state has never done an SEJ, a specific SEJ analysis. It's never allowed
Can you say what SCJ is?
social and economic justification, but that's what you're talking about. Never done an individual, no one's ever said, I want permission to actually degrade the water, is that correct? I mean, no one's ever come to you and say, we have a permit and we can't go forward without having more than a limited lowering.
More than,
Right.
The analysis has been done in a few, maybe 2 or 3 instances with very large, primarily stormwater projects, I believe.
like
Yeah, where they had,
John
no
worked
value.
on that.
Yeah. But,
Which one, I'm sorry?
Kingdom.
Yeah, but they didn't actually, in the end, in that one, they found a way to not have more than. a
Right, that pushed
So
back.
I just want the committee to understand that, and this comes out when we get to talk about our comments on the rule. Like, we just wanted to make it clear, and I think it's already the EPA policy. It's very hard to get specific permission to have more than a limited lowering of waters. That's the policy. And then the other important point is, even if you get that permission, then the lowering has to be the least amount of lowering possible.
Right.
So it's not like it's then, oh, you get a free pass just to like do whatever you want. You'd have to work with the agency to make it the smallest amount of more than a limited lowering possible. And again, we haven't actually ever done that, and we hope it never happens. We never want it, and I think the agency agrees, right?
Right. It's that iterative process that I was referring to earlier, looking at alternatives and looking, how can we achieve more and more and more treatment and control till you get to the point where, to go further, the cost would accelerate rapidly, and you could therefore say that would be a substantial socioeconomic impact to the people of the state.
And this is Hannah Smith with the Agency of Natural Resources. Just to reemphasize what John and Pete are walking through, this process, the anti-degradation proposed rule provides a very extensive process for doing this analysis, but it is a backstop on a backstop. It, like John said, the agency makes every effort in the permitting process to guarantee that no limited lowering is ever needed. And at that point, this extensive process is available as a tool to evaluate whether it's at all allowable under the Clean Water Act.
Right, so the limited lowering that's allowed ends up coming out of professional, and you were saying you can't do every single project. So does that mean it's incumbent on a professional engineer to use the manual to design a system that achieves a limited impact on water's state within the guidelines of the manual?
That's correct, that if an engineer designs such a system to meet the criteria in the manual after review by the agency and confirmation of that, then that would provide any discharge, even at a molecular level, would be a limited lowering. But limiting that limited lowering through the provisions in the manual for stormwater discharges satisfies this concept of anti-degradation. That's what we're saying.
So the manual plus a professional engineer designing the project is the way we implement it in a way that you don't have to be out there doing, reviewing everything. Do you review on? I'm guessing you don't, if it comes from a professional engineer, that's sort of the proxy review, right?
We
Or do you have to
individual permits, we review all individual permits, even if they're designed by, if they have to be designed by a professional engineer. Authorizations under a general permit, there are certain reviews, there's a percentage of reviews that take place, a targeted percentage of reviews, but typically an authorization under a general permit, when we issue a general permit, that general permit in and of itself goes through the anti-degradation process to make the confirmation that the allowances in that general permit result in a limited low, would only result in a limited lower.
And so as these permits are issued and there's a limited lowering of water quality because of the alterations to things, how do you know that the cumulative impact of each permit hasn't brought us down to a too low a level and we're dropping out of that class?
It's a great question, Chair Bray.
Yeah, so in terms of evaluating cumulative impact, so if you look at the steps in terms of the, tier 2 analysis, evaluating what the existing condition of that water quality is, that's going to reflect the cumulative impact of all of the activities, whether it's jurisdictional or sub-jurisdictional or not jurisdictional at all, in terms of being covered under one of our permitting programs. So that existing water quality is what is reflective of that cumulative impact.
Great, thank you. Sarah?
Thank you, Chair Bray. I don't fully understand the answer there. So would you mind describing that again? Because so what I'm hearing is that you don't look at the cumulative impact, but that it is all seen, and if the water quality was lowered itself, is that what you're describing?
So in terms of how we measure cumulative impact, and so there's, we have many monitoring programs throughout the state.
Yeah.
And we'll do our monitoring on a rotational basis for the most part, basin by basin. So that's sort of indexes with the tactical basin planning process. But we'll evaluate and have a way of prioritizing what sites we go to evaluate what is that existing condition. If there is a significant project that could result in more than a limited lowering, then we would be out or would ask the applicant to, or require the applicant to monitor, before construction to establish what that, baseline is. How, what is the existing condition of the water relative to that minimum water quality criteria? So we would be able to evaluate that proposed impact of, from that activity. And so by knowing, with the watershed concept, any activity that is upstream of that, of where the proposed development would occur would be reflected within the condition of that water. And so we wouldn't necessarily know, okay, is the sediment that we're seeing in the stream a result of, the logging activity upstream or whatever else might be going on, but we would be able to index what that water quality is relative to the minimum criteria.
Okay, so just so I can understand a little more, you look at the permits individually, but then if the water quality does seem to go down or would go down, that's when you.
If there is a significant project, and I think we, gave the example of Kingdom Community, then we would do a very, site-specific analysis to understand what is the existing condition of the water. For most, we've talked a lot about our stormwater permits, and it's because that area, that developed area is discharging at the time that there are runoff conditions, it's really hard to evaluate, first of all, the impact of one single development on that water quality, but it's also the conditions are constantly fluctuating. So you're at a high, you have a high volume of water in the stream at the time when you're having phosphorus or sediment going into the stream. And so it's hard to evaluate what that is, or what the impact of that will be, because that is constantly changing in terms of how much water is moving through the stream.
So you don't look at the permits cumulatively.
We would in our overall monitoring of Vermont water. So we might look at, how the overall health of our streams, but because we have a lot of activity going on in the watershed, we can't say, oh, well, there's activities that are sub-jurisdictional for stormwater, for example. So what we're seeing isn't necessarily just a result of our permitting activity, but also the result of what isn't permitted. So that makes sense.
So if this is like a first blush on this situation. So if I'm understanding you correctly, and I don't know if you've directly answered it, but I think the answer is no, that you don't look at them cumulatively based on this. But what you do look at is the general quality of the water in a location. So it's not that if one person gets a permit and then hey, it looks like we're gonna get 3 or 4 more permits, that you're looking at that all together. Rather, it's you look at each individual permit.
We look at each individual permit as it comes along relative to the quality of the water in the watershed. So when we talk about cumulative impacts, we're talking about existing impacts that are occurring in the watershed above the point of concern. So if the particular project is going in at River Mile 10, we would look at everything upstream of that, look at the various impacts in the watershed, permitted, unpermitted, sub-jurisdictional, non-jurisdictional. We would the integration of our assessment of water quality at a point in a watershed speaks to everything, all cumulative impacts going on upstream of that. And that's the indexing to where you are in terms of the degree of high quality.
Is that the strongest way we can do that?
Yes.
In your opinion?
Yes.
Okay.
And so when you say sub-jurisdictional, that might be impervious surface of less than a half acre.
That's exactly
Okay,
correct.
and non-jurisdictional is, I put in what RAPs or AMP based discharges.
It could be something like that. It could be something that we don't have a permitting program for. As you know, Chair Bray, our permitting programs through state law and federal law are fairly extensive.
Yeah.
We catch a lot of what's going on out there in the watershed, but there are things that we don't permit.
Yeah. So if we succeed and we sort all this out, and now reclassification happens to the list of grid plus whatever waters, is that now that floor just moved up? And does that mean that you're anticipating that A&R will have to be, I don't know, more active, more vigilant, because permits or the degradation allowed, the margin will there'll be less room there'll be less degradation than a limited lowering water quality before we would drop out of that higher class.
Yes, and we'll get to that and what the proposed anti-deg implementation rule does in terms of changing how we apply anti-deg to these very high quality waters, both A1 and B1.
But you described exactly, Chair Bray, the concept of raising that floor, limiting the available assimilative capacity, and then we will target our monitoring. If you want to talk a little bit about targeting our monitoring more frequently to these higher class waters, we have to pick and choose. You know, we have finite monitoring resources, so we want to be doing several things with our resources. We want to be looking at our effectiveness in recovering impaired waters and bringing them back up to meet criteria. We want to be able to gauge our effectiveness there. We want to identify new waters that are eligible for reclassification to a higher class. And then thirdly, we want to be able to look at how we're doing in terms of managing the assimilative capacity and in any existing class. So we have to pick and choose and prioritize our monitoring efforts, but we aim to do all three of those things on an annual basis.
Sounds like you're signing up for a lot more work.
It's important.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm serious. Like, it's okay. If we start gaining on the list, then the level of scrutiny has to go up with it in order to maintain water quality at those higher levels.
That's correct.
Using over time. Senator McDowell.
Mr. Chair, the law is you can't degrade the rivers unless there's an overriding socioeconomic reason to say it's okay. Is that what we're being told?
Anti-degradation, it's a really interesting concept. It's a confusing concept, but it's an interesting concept. Without anti-degradation, we would be tasked with managing our waters at the minimum. We set minimum criteria for each class, and we say to maintain the uses that exist in this class, you can't go below the minimum. The minimum are sufficient to support these uses. That's what we're saying. And so without the concept of anti-degradation, you could always manage to those minimums. You would say if the dissolved oxygen has to be 6 parts per million to support trout, and the actual dissolved oxygen out the stream, we go out and measure it and it's 8.5. And a project comes along and they say, I want to discharge to this water, and that discharge is going to knock the dissolved oxygen down to 6. It still supports the use of trout in that class. So anti-degradation says, no, you can't just manage to the minimums. Without that, it would be a free fall to the minimums. Anti-degradation sets up a process wherein you grudgingly give away only to avoid substantial adverse socioeconomic impact, those words that are difficult to define when you're looking at any individual project, but you grudgingly allow a limited lowering towards that minimum. Because any permit that we issue, and we're tasked with issuing a lot of permits, my division issues 43 different types of permits, and we issue about 2,000 a year. So we issue a lot of permits, but any one of those permits allows for a limited lowering, but it asks the question through anti-degradation, is that limited lowering necessary? Is there an alternative to that limited lowering to minimize that limited lowering? And if so, would requiring that alternative result in that adverse socioeconomic impact? We come at it through a number of different ways. I've talked a lot about the stormwater manual today, but we come at what that balance point is between a limited lowering, still within the range of protecting those uses, which is the tier 1 protection that I'll talk about now, but limited that lower. That's the concept, not managing to the minimum.
So, Mr. Chair, the witnesses working hard to help us understand this.
Yes, you really are.
And you are playing the cards that you've been dealt. And be a pretty darn good bridge partner. But we, the Senate, sent the House a bill this last week, which said we're going to override, preempt local requirements that tackle degradation of our rivers. And we're going to override them and say, we think that we apparently said we think it's more important to override those and allow the continuation of putting raw sewage into our streams because of the socioeconomic needs that we feel we have to address, and we're asking you to carry this out. Am I missing something here?
We cannot ever permit,
Yes.
we cannot ever permit anything that violates water quality standards. You know, that would be an illegal
Well,
permit.
Apparently we can. Apparently we can.
We also, I mean, we're governed by both state and federal law. So we have the Clean Water Act as a backstop, and we have our friends in Boston at EPA looking over our shoulder in terms of our permitting of federal permits. As you know, we're a delegated state and we issue federal permits for many things. And we're also tasked with maintaining those minimum levels in the water quality standards. I'm not familiar with, I'm not entirely familiar with the bill that you're referring to, Senator McDonald, but it certainly it could elevate the importance of socioeconomic benefit from certain activities, but we wouldn't be able to permit raw sewage. We would, we still have certain those minimum criteria necessary to protect the uses that Bethany spoke about in the beginning. Those minimum criteria are absolute. We cannot permit below them.
So I respect, Mr. Chair, I should have said raw sewage when it rains a lot. It's not a,
So that if I can, Senator McDonald, we passed the housing bill and
Yep.
accelerates housing in designated areas, and Senator McDonald's referring to the place that there are designated areas, towns with designated areas where more housing will be allowed. And some of these places already have CSO events. So if we're adding more housing to a municipality with CSO events already, are we not exacerbating the CSO events? Or we're basically we're authorizing more discharge in the air. I think and it lays on us because we're the ones who, yes, go ahead, please build there.
I see. Thank you for that explanation, Chair Bright. And right, that could additional development in a CSO area pending the implementation of additional CSO elimination projects, which, as you know, we're working on, where we issue towns orders to come up with a plan to take off the rainwater flow, the precipitation that occurs that causes those CSO events. So we're constantly working away, and you're exactly right, Senator McDonald. It costs an incredible amount of money. We've had great success in Vermont at reducing and eliminating many CSOs, and it's the difficult ones that are left, the extremely logistically difficult and extremely expensive ones that are left. And any additional contribution to those service areas could exacerbate the frequency, intensity, or duration of those CSO events. But we are working aggressively, and we're spending a large amount of some of the federal money coming to Vermont through ARPA and through the build funds to accelerating the reduction of those CSOs by peeling off the stormwater that goes into those systems. It's a slow, expensive, and logistically difficult process, sure.
So I just want to check in on time.
Yes.
We're having a great discussion. I don't want to cramp any of our style here, but where do you?
I'll pick up the pace.
Well, no, I
You're close
don't
to-
want to rush you. It's just how much more of this presentation do
They
you
have like
have?
4
I'm
slides.
looking-
I'd say 4, maybe 5 more slides.
Okay, great. I'll try to stifle my own enthusiasm for asking questions a little bit. I do have one quick one though on the way
Of
to
course.
the slide, and that is, so I very much appreciate the notion that you're always trying to have the grudgingly yield a lowering of water quality. Do you have the fear that over time though, however grudgingly we've yielded, that we will eventually end up at the minimum quality standard for that class?
Or below.
It's a great question, Chair Bray. I mean, the concept of a similar capacity is that it is a limited resource, and we do, we would pick up our grudginess as we approach that minimum value, but we have to manage, the minimum criteria do meet the designated uses. I'd say that that would be a long time in coming, the situation that you described. And all the while, for example, with our stormwater manual, all the while, our treatment and control practices, the evolution of the science and the engineering gets better and better. We do so much better now than we did 20 years ago in those things, and I can only imagine that that's going to continue to get better over time. Same with our wastewater discharges. We've moved to tertiary treatment, and we're ratcheting down on the tertiary treatment requirements on many facilities around the state. All of that comes balancing those increasing costs and, you know, also implementing new science, new engineering standards all the while. So those limited lowerings are occurring at smaller and smaller intervals. The final tier, tier one, you see why we spoke about this for a year. The final tier, tier one, gets to the protection of existing uses. So the level of water quality necessary to protect those existing uses shall be maintained and protected. So again, that floor at any given class is absolute. In the rule, we, you know, through discussions with the group and achieving consensus around the table with the group, we have put in this date, July 1st, 2023, and biennially thereafter, the secretary will evaluate existing water quality data for waters that meet or exceed those minimum criteria for one or more designated uses. And where the secretary does make this determination, the secretary will ensure the maintenance of that water quality on an immediate basis. And then beginning at our next triennial review, we're suggesting January 1st of 26. And upon each subsequent triennial review, the secretary shall propose in rulemaking, in which is the water quality standards update. It's a rule that we reclassify waters through updating that rule. We would make the commitment to move forward in a consistent manner to propose the reclassification of those waters that do meet these criteria. So that's tier one protection. This indexes now anti-DAG rule, the implementation rule, with the legislative initiative to remove the prohibition. So currently, there exists a prohibition in A waters of on-site systems greater than 1,000 gallons per day. There is no clear nexus between that particular number or any number relative to water quality protection. And as we talked about the last time, and as you heard several other witnesses testify, it may in fact impede resolving water quality issues for existing failed systems or other problems in that watershed. And so again, we are recommending the removal of that prohibition to allow us to move forward much more effectively, much more efficiently in terms of resetting the floor for those higher quality waters. And then in the anti-degradation rule, looking at individual permit requirements, not the use of general permits with pre-existing anti-DEG assumptions, but instead looking individually at any permit issued in those watersheds, in the A1, B1, and A2 watersheds, considering the location, size, scale of the proposed activity and its potential for impact on water quality, and requiring, you know, putting in those tier one requirements that I mentioned a moment ago, that provisional, if you will, reclassification of waters, and then the requirement for us to move those forward through rulemaking. This is a map, a very busy map, very busy map, but this map has been provided to you in a more readable, more accessible scale, along with the list of these actual waters. So these are candidate A1 and B1 waters, both lakes and rivers around the state, that would be eligible for reclassification. And again, we did provide this list both in tabular form and also a much more readable map.
Yes, thank you very much for sending that along.
Thank you, Chair Murray. So we don't seem to have that. Jude was kind enough to send what she believed was the correct information, but that's not what you're describing.
Oh, okay.
So perhaps it was,
Resend it.
We'll
Yeah.
resend that.
perhaps we could send it out.
Okay,
Right,
thanks.
Because it includes this map.
Mhm.
Yeah, then no,
Yeah,
I
that'll-
haven't been
that'll
able to
better
find
scale.
it on the, okay. Thank you.
Sharon.
Thank you. So we So I'm looking at the bill. There's so many. It's very exciting, right? Like it does feel like, okay, so I'm not sure that it's like a trade-off. Maybe it could be thought of as a trade-off, but like, giving up this 1,000-gallon limit, but what we get hopefully out of it is that more of these waters will be reclassified at a higher level. We're going to raise the floor. And so one of the things I think would be really cool and interesting is to see after, like, let's say this passes, then like, I assume we'll get some kind of a report back on here's what happened. Like, here are all the waters that got reclassified, which are now going to be protected at a higher level as a result.
There's currently a reporting requirement
Okay.
in the proposed language that would
Okay.
have us produce a report both to your committee and to the House committee to annually to report on progress in doing that.
Okay, and
Both
so
in
that's
terms of identifying new waters and then also waters that we've actually reclassified.
cool. And so that's in the bill already. Okay, good.
Well,
Oh,
and
no,
so when after break, when we go to the statute, I had asked parties to work with, create a red line on the bill so that we look at proposed language changes from both the agency and the advocacy community. So we'll turn to that after break, and you'll see more proposals that I think bring the two sides closer together. That's like our next task is looking at the statute. And are there, and just so I keep all the moving parts straight, are there proposals? Well, there's also a proposal to change the rule as well, right? I don't know if
The proposal would be to index the rule so that it dovetails well with the statute. So changes to the statute we would want the two to be consistent.
Yeah.
I think we've had a number of discussions. We had a meeting this week with the environmental advocacy groups and with Jeff Nelson and Warren Coleman, both of whom, as you know, testified. They were part of the stakeholder group. It was a good meeting, and I think we've come even closer to consensus on language. There are still a couple of concepts that I'm sure we'll chat about in a while when Mason and John and Jared have a chance to speak.
great. All right, so
This is our last slide. Finally, I'm sorry about this presentation. I'm sorry it's taken so long. It's a complex topic and it's
Yeah.
hard to hit the high points of
Yeah.
something like
please,
this.
no need to apologize. I mean, one, it's, as you say, it's complicated. Two, we really want to learn more so that as we sort through the issue that we're feeling well informed.
And three, we made it long.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think they're quick to tell you about
We appreciate the
Your
time
question.
and your question and patience. with it.
49 questions so far. Okay, so,
Our final slide just is to recount a couple of the things that we have said during the course of the presentation, that we feel like the anti-DEG implementation rule would provide much better and more appropriate protection for these very high quality waters than this one size fits all existing 1,000-gallon per day prohibition. We really feel like classification of the waters and regulatory management requirements should be separate processes. We've seen the effect of having that prohibition weigh upon classification of waters that really should be based upon the quality of the water, so that we're sorting our waters much more effectively into buckets based upon their existing criteria and providing the protections necessary by moving those floor values as we talked about. We feel like removing that existing prohibition would enable us to much more efficiently move those waters forward with that singular focus on their existing water quality. And we've made that commitment to do that, as the dates in our tier 1 slide showed a moment ago. It's important also to reinforce that we're proposing this only affect waters going forward, not removal of the prohibition for all of the A waters above 2,500 and the few A1 waters that currently exist below 2,500. It's also important just to point out, and several of you have mentioned this, but I will say it again, that those waters currently are B2. with that floor, that very, very low floor, and that wide range of potential assimilative capacity currently, reclassifying based upon their quality and resetting that floor to higher, more appropriate levels to provide good protection for these waters. We feel like this will allow us to, this proposal, if moved forward, will allow us to accomplish those things. And again, I really do appreciate your patience and your questions around. That would conclude our testimony.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that really helpful walkthrough on rule and the related background. Any more committee questions for Mr. O'Flamm or Ms. Sargent? So we're running a little ahead. We're not used to that. But so we'll take a 20-minute break till 10:10, and then we'll pick up, and we have Mr. Overstreet provided me with a red line of the bill, the statute, and we'll go through that with you all and have a presentation and then discussion and see if we keep marching towards getting to a finish line this week. My hope is that we feel like we've reached a good position on the different elements that need to be combined in both the rule and the statute, and vote the bill out this week. So